The blade trembled in Ralph Mitchell's weathered hands as he stared down at the woman who had haunted his dreams for 3 long months. Nancy Reed lay motionless on the rough wooden floor of his longhouse. Her auburn hair spread like spilled wine across the furs. Blood seeped from a gash on her temple where the Raiders Club had struck, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps. "I haven't known a woman since the last raid," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking like ice on a frozen fjord. The words escaped him unbidden, a confession to the shadows that danced in the firelight. His massive frame shook not from the bitter Norse wind that howled through the gaps in the timber walls, but from something far more dangerous. Fear, not of death or battle, for those were old companions, but of the tenderness that had taken root in his warrior's heart. The iron sword clattered to the floor as Ralph dropped to his knees beside her still form. His calloused fingers hovered over her face, afraid to touch what he might destroy. 3 months ago, he had been nothing more than another Viking raider, his soul as cold and sharp as the blade he wielded. Now, as he looked upon Nancy's pale features, he understood that everything had changed. The wind outside grew fiercer, rattling the shutters and sending sparks from the central fire pit dancing toward the smoke hole above. Ralph's hands found their way to Nancy's shoulders, and with infinite care he lifted her from the floor. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the faint flutter of her pulse against his palm. "Stay with me," he murmured, carrying her toward his sleeping alcove. "You cannot leave me now, not when I have finally learned what it means to live. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The memory of their first meeting crashed over him like a rogue wave as he settled her onto the thick furs of his bed. It had been autumn when the raiding party returned from the southern settlements, their longships heavy with plunder and captives. Nancy had been among the prisoners, her defiant green eyes blazing even as iron shackles bound her wrists. While the other Vikings had seen only another slave to be sold or traded, Ralph had glimpsed something that made his breath catch in his throat. She had not cowered like the others, even as Douglas Harris, the raid leader, had shoved her toward the slave pens. Nancy had held her head high. Her torn dress could not diminish her dignity, nor could the dirt on her face hide her beauty. But it was not her appearance that had captured Ralph's attention. It was the fire in her spirit, the unbroken will that reminded him of the wild horses that roamed the northern mountains. That first night, as the other raiders celebrated their successful voyage with ale and boasting, Ralph had found himself walking past the slave quarters. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, he had seen Nancy sitting apart from the other captives, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared into the darkness. She had not been weeping like the others. Instead, she had been planning, her sharp mind already working to find a way to survive in this harsh new world. "You're different from the rest," she had said when she noticed him watching. Her voice had been steady despite her circumstances, carrying an accent that spoke of distant lands and gentle upbringings. "You don't look at us like we're cattle." Ralph had been so startled by her directness that he had nearly fled back to the Great Hall. No slave had ever spoken to him with such boldness, and certainly none had looked him in the eye as if they were equals. But something in her manner had rooted his feet to the ground. "You should not speak so freely," he had warned, though his tone carried no real menace. "Others would strike you for such words." "Would you?" Nancy had asked, rising to her feet with fluid grace despite the chains that bound her. The question had hung in the cold air between them like a challenge. Ralph had known the answer even then, though it had taken him weeks to admit it to himself. He could no more raise a hand against this woman than he could command the sun to rise in the west. Now, as he dampened a cloth in the wooden basin beside his bed, Ralph's thoughts returned to that pivotal moment. He had walked away without answering her question, but they both had known the truth. From that night forward, his path had been set, though he had fought against it with every fiber of his being. The days that followed had blurred together in a haze of internal conflict. Ralph had found excuses to check on the slaves, telling himself he was merely ensuring they remained healthy enough to fetch good prices at market, but his eyes had always sought Nancy among the huddled forms, and more often than not, he had found her watching him with those intelligent green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. It was Tyler Turner who had first noticed Ralph's unusual interest in the auburn-haired captive. The younger warrior had cornered Ralph near the blacksmith's forge one gray morning, his scarred face twisted into a knowing smirk. "The slave girl has caught your fancy, hasn't she?" Tyler had said, his voice low enough that the other men working nearby could not overhear. "I've seen how you look at her, like a starving man stares at fresh bread." Ralph had denied it, of course. He had claimed that his attention was purely practical, that he was simply evaluating the merchandise like any shrewd trader would. But Tyler had laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the morning mist like a blade. "Lie to yourself if you must, but don't insult my intelligence," Tyler had said. "Half the men in the settlement have noticed your fascination with the foreign woman. Douglas Harris, most of all." The mention of the raid leader's name had sent ice through Ralph's veins. Douglas was not a man to cross, and his claim on the captives was absolute until they were sold or distributed according to his wishes. Any interference with his property would be seen as a challenge to his authority, and challenges were settled with blood in their harsh world. "What are you suggesting?" Ralph had asked, though he had already known the answer. "Buy her," Tyler had said simply. "You have silver from the raids, and Douglas values coin above all else. Make him an offer he cannot refuse, and the woman becomes yours to do with as you please." The suggestion had both thrilled and terrified Ralph. To own Nancy would mean having her close, being able to protect her from the casual cruelties that befell most slaves. But it would also mean acknowledging the feelings that had been growing in his chest like wildfire, emotions that had no place in a Viking warrior's heart. For days, Ralph had wrestled with Tyler's suggestion. He had avoided the slave quarters, throwing himself into his duties with desperate intensity. He had sharpened every blade in his collection until they could split hairs, mended every piece of leather armor until it gleamed like new, and practiced his sword work until his muscles screamed for mercy. But no amount of physical exertion could quiet the voice in his head that whispered Nancy's name. The decision had been made for him on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn. Ralph had been returning from a hunting expedition with Anthony Lopez when they had heard the commotion coming from the slave quarters. Shouts and cruel laughter had echoed across the settlement, drawing curious onlookers like carrion birds to a fresh kill. Through the crowd of spectators, Ralph had seen Nancy backed against the wooden wall of the slave pen, her dress torn at the shoulder and her face flushed with anger and fear. 3 of Douglas Harris's men had cornered her, their intentions clear in their leering faces and grasping hands. The other slaves had pressed themselves against the far wall, too terrified to intervene. "Come now, beauty," one of the men had slurred, his words thick with ale. "No need to be shy. We just want a taste of what you're offering." Nancy had held a broken piece of pottery in her hand like a weapon, her green eyes blazing with defiance, even as her chest heaved with exertion. "Stay back," she had warned, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll cut the first man who touches me." The men had laughed at her threat, advancing slowly like wolves circling wounded prey. Ralph had felt something snap inside his chest, a sound like breaking ice that seemed to echo through his very bones. Before he had realized what he was doing, his hand had found the hilt of his sword. "That's enough," he had said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. The crowd had parted before him as he strode forward, his massive frame casting long shadows in the flickering torchlight. The 3 men had turned to face him, their expressions shifting from amusement to wariness. They had known Ralph's reputation as a warrior, had seen him fight in countless battles and raids. None of them had been eager to test their skills against his blade. "This is none of your concern, Ralph," the leader had said, though his voice had lacked conviction. "Douglas gave us permission to sample the merchandise." "Did he?" Ralph had asked, his tone deceptively calm. "Then you won't mind if I ask him myself." The mention of their leader's name had given the men pause. They had known as well as Ralph that Douglas had given no such permission, that they were acting on their own lustful impulses. To be caught in a lie would mean facing Douglas's wrath, and that was a fate worse than death in their harsh world. "Perhaps we were mistaken," the leader had muttered, taking a step back from Nancy's defiant form. "The woman can wait for another time." "She can wait forever," Ralph had said, his hand still resting on his sword hilt, "because she's no longer available." The words had surprised him as much as they had shocked the onlookers. He had not planned to make such a declaration, had not even consciously decided to claim Nancy as his own. But once the words had left his lips, he had felt a strange sense of rightness, as if he had finally spoken a truth that had been burning in his chest for weeks. "You cannot simply claim a slave without payment," one of the men had protested. "Douglas will never allow it." "Then I'll buy her," Ralph had said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Tonight, name your price, and I'll pay it." The confrontation had ended there, with the three men slinking away like beaten dogs, and the crowd dispersing to spread word of Ralph's unexpected declaration. But for Nancy, the real ordeal had just begun. She had stood frozen against the wall long after the others had left, her makeshift weapon still clutched in her white-knuckled fist. Ralph had approached her slowly, his hands held open and empty to show that he meant no harm. "Are you hurt?" he had asked, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. Nancy had shaken her head, though he could see the lie in the way she favored her left shoulder. One of the men had grabbed her roughly before Ralph's arrival, leaving bruises that would take days to fade. "Weak," she had whispered, her green eyes searching his face for answers he was not sure he could give. Ralph had been quiet for a long moment, studying the woman who had turned his world upside down without even trying. How could he explain that she had awakened something in him that he had thought long dead? How could he tell her that her courage in the face of impossible odds had reminded him of the man he used to be, before years of raiding and killing had hardened his heart to stone? "Because no one should be treated like an animal," he had said finally, though they both had known there was more to it than simple compassion. "And what happens now?" Nancy had asked. "When you buy me from Douglas Harris, what then? Do I simply trade one master for another?" The question had cut deeper than any blade Ralph had ever felt. He had wanted to tell her that she would be free, that he would release her from bondage and send her home to whatever family awaited her return. But they had both known such promises were meaningless in their harsh world. A woman alone, especially a foreigner, would not survive a day in the wilderness that surrounded their settlement. "You'll be safe," he had said instead, and something in his tone had made her lower her improvised weapon at last. "Safe," she had repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. "I haven't felt safe since the day your people burned my village and slaughtered my family." The pain in her voice had been like a physical blow, reminding Ralph of all the suffering his kind had inflicted on innocent people. He had been part of that raid, had helped load the longships with plunder while buildings burned behind them. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, cold and unforgiving. "I cannot undo what was done," he had said quietly, "but I can ensure it never happens to you again." Nancy had studied his face in the flickering torchlight, searching for deception or hidden cruelty. Whatever she had seen there had seemed to satisfy her, because she had finally allowed her shoulders to relax. "What's your name?" she had asked. "Ralph Mitchell," he had replied, surprised by how strange his own name sounded when spoken aloud. "Nancy Reed," she had said in return, "though I suppose that matters little now." "It matters to me," Ralph had said, and he had meant it with every fiber of his being. That night, Ralph had sought out Douglas Harris in the Great Hall, where the raid leader had been holding court among his most trusted warriors. The conversation had been brief and businesslike, with Douglas naming a price that would have bankrupted a lesser man. But Ralph had paid it without hesitation, counting out silver coins with steady hands while his heart hammered against his ribs. "She must be quite the beauty to command such a price," Douglas had observed, his cold eyes glittering with amusement. "I hope she proves worth the investment." "She will," Ralph had replied, though he had not been entirely sure what he meant by those words. The transaction had been completed with the scratching of quills on parchment, making Nancy Reed the legal property of Ralph Mitchell, according to the laws of their harsh land. But as Ralph had walked through the settlement toward his longhouse, the bill of sale clutched in his hand, he had known that ownership was the furthest thing from his mind. The first weeks of Nancy's life in Ralph's longhouse had been a delicate dance of boundaries and unspoken understandings. He had given her the small sleeping alcove that adjoined the main room, hanging thick furs across the entrance to provide privacy. Her meals had been the same as his own, simple but nourishing fare that bore no resemblance to the thin gruel served to the other slaves. Most importantly, he had never once demanded the services that were considered his right as her owner. Nancy had clearly expected such demands, had braced herself for the inevitable moment when he would claim what he had paid for. But days had turned to weeks, and Ralph had maintained a respectful distance that seemed to puzzle and intrigue her in equal measure. "You're not like the others," she had observed one evening as they sat by the fire, she mending a tear in her dress while he sharpened his weapons. "The other warriors, I mean. They look at their slaves like possessions to be used and discarded. You look at me like—" She had paused, searching for the right words. "Like what?" Ralph had asked, though he had been afraid to hear her answer. "Like I'm still a person," Nancy had finished softly. The simple statement had hit Ralph like a physical blow. Of course she was still a person, with thoughts and feelings and dreams of her own. How had his people become so callous that basic humanity was seen as unusual kindness? "You are a person," he had said firmly. "Nothing that has happened changes that." Nancy had looked up from her mending then, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Then why did you buy me? If you see me as a person rather than property, why not simply let me go?" It was a question Ralph had asked himself countless times during the long nights when sleep eluded him. The honest answer was too dangerous to speak aloud, too revealing of the feelings that had taken root in his chest like wildflowers in spring. "Where would you go?" he had asked instead. "Your village is ash, your family gone. Even if you could somehow cross the wilderness alone, what waits for you in the lands beyond?" Nancy's hands had stilled on her needlework, and for a moment Ralph had seen the full weight of her loss reflected in her expression. She had lost everything in the raid that brought her to this place. Everyone she had ever loved, reduced to memory and smoke. "I had a sister," she had said quietly. "Hannah. She was to be married in the spring to a blacksmith's son from the neighboring village. They might have escaped when your people came. I tell myself they did, that somewhere she's living the life we always dreamed of." The hope in her voice had been heartbreaking in its fragility. Ralph had wanted to promise her that her sister was safe, that someday they would be reunited. But he had seen too many raids, knew too well how few escaped the Viking longships when they appeared on the horizon like harbingers of doom. "Hope is not foolishness," he had said instead. "It's what keeps us human when the world tries to make us into beasts." Nancy had smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made Ralph's breath catch in his throat. It was the first genuine happiness he had seen from her since the night he had claimed her as his own. As autumn had given way to winter, their evening conversations had become a cherished ritual. Nancy had told him stories of her homeland, of green valleys and peaceful villages where children played in flower-filled meadows. In return, Ralph had shared tales of his own childhood, before the raids and battles had claimed so much of his soul. "I wasn't always a warrior," he had confessed one snowy evening. "My father was a farmer, tended the best barley fields in our valley. I thought I'd follow in his footsteps, marry a local girl and raise fat children who would never know hunger or fear." "What changed?" Nancy had asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Raiders came to our valley when I was 16, Ralph had said, his voice growing distant with memory. "Not Vikings, but men from the eastern kingdoms who thought our prosperity made us easy prey. They killed my father, burned our crops, took everything we had worked so hard to build." Nancy had set aside her needlework, giving him her full attention as he continued. "I joined the Viking raiders not for glory or gold, but for revenge. I thought if I became strong enough, fierce enough, I could prevent what happened to my family from happening to others. But somewhere along the way, I became the very thing I had set out to destroy." The confession had hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Ralph had never spoken those words aloud before, had barely admitted the truth to himself. But something about Nancy's presence made honesty feel not just possible, but necessary. "And now?" she had asked softly. "Now I look at you and remember who I used to be," Ralph had replied, "before the killing and the taking, when I still believed the world could be something better than an endless cycle of violence." Nancy had reached across the space between them then, her small hand covering his scarred knuckles with surprising warmth. The simple touch had sent electricity through Ralph's entire body, a sensation more powerful than any battle rage he had ever experienced. "Maybe it still can be," she had whispered. That night had marked a turning point in their relationship, though neither had spoken of it directly. The careful distance Ralph had maintained began to shrink, replaced by small gestures of intimacy that spoke louder than words. Nancy would brush his shoulder as she passed, or let her fingers linger when handing him his evening meal. Ralph would find excuses to sit closer to her by the fire, or offer his cloak when the winter wind made the longhouse walls shudder. They were falling in love, though neither dared name the emotion that grew stronger with each passing day. In their harsh world, such feelings were seen as weakness, distractions that could get a warrior killed. But Ralph found that his growing affection for Nancy made him stronger rather than weaker, gave him something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. The other warriors had begun to notice the change in him. Tyler Turner had commented on Ralph's improved mood, while Anthony Lopez had joked about the spring in his step despite the bitter winter weather. Even Douglas Harris had made observations, though his were tinged with suspicion rather than amusement. "Your slave seems to have tamed the great Ralph Mitchell," Douglas had said one evening in the Great Hall, his words carrying just enough edge to make them sound like a challenge. "She's earned her keep," Ralph had replied carefully, unwilling to give Douglas any ammunition to use against him. "I'm sure she has," Douglas had said with a knowing smirk, "though I wonder if you have grown too attached to your property. A warrior who cannot bear to lose what he owns is a warrior who has already been defeated." The words had been a warning, Ralph had realized. Douglas was reminding him that in their world, everything could be taken away at a moment's notice. Slaves could be sold or traded, warriors could be killed in battle, and emotional attachments were luxuries that few could afford. But as Ralph had returned to his longhouse that night and found Nancy waiting by the fire with a warm meal and a welcoming smile, he had decided that some luxuries were worth any price. Winter's grip had tightened on the settlement like a frozen fist, bringing with it the long nights in howling winds that drove even the hardiest Vikings to seek shelter indoors. It was during these dark months that Ralph and Nancy's relationship had deepened beyond mere companionship into something that neither could deny, though both were afraid to name. The change had been gradual at first, like ice slowly forming on a still pond. Nancy had begun to anticipate Ralph's needs before he voiced them, having his weapons cleaned and his meals prepared without being asked. In return, Ralph had started bringing her small gifts from his travels around the settlement: a piece of amber from the shore, a carved bone comb from the market, a length of fine wool that would make a warmer dress. "You don't have to bring me presents," Nancy had protested one evening when Ralph had presented her with a delicate silver brooch shaped like a raven. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," Ralph had replied, his fingers fumbling with the clasp as he pinned the brooch to her dress. "But I want to." The simple declaration had carried more weight than any flowery speech. In their world of harsh practicality, want was a dangerous luxury, an admission of vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies. But Ralph had spoken the word without shame, and Nancy had felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his honesty. It was on the longest night of winter that everything had changed between them. A fierce storm had battered the settlement for 3 days, piling snow against the longhouse walls and sending the temperature plummeting to levels that made breathing painful. The fire in the central hearth had burned constantly, but even its warmth could not reach the sleeping alcoves where the cold crept in through gaps in the timber. Ralph had been awakened by the sound of Nancy's teeth chattering, a rapid clicking that cut through the howling wind like a distress signal. He had found her huddled under every fur and blanket she possessed, yet still shivering uncontrollably in the grip of the merciless cold. "You'll freeze to death," he had said, kneeling beside her sleeping pallet with genuine concern etched across his weathered features. "I'm fine," Nancy had insisted through chattering teeth, though they both knew it was a lie. Her lips had been blue with cold, and her fingers had been so stiff she could barely move them. Ralph had made a decision then that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Without a word, he had scooped Nancy into his arms, furs and all, and carried her to his own sleeping alcove. His bed was larger and closer to the fire, the thick walls providing better insulation against the storm's fury. "What are you doing?" Nancy had asked, though she had not struggled against his embrace. "Keeping you alive," Ralph had replied simply, settling her onto his bed before climbing in beside her. The intimacy of sharing a bed had been overwhelming at first, both of them lying rigid and careful not to touch despite the practical necessity of their arrangement. But as the night had worn on and Nancy's shivering had gradually subsided, they had found themselves drawn together by more than just the need for warmth. Ralph had felt Nancy relax against him, her breathing growing deep and even as sleep finally claimed her. But he had remained awake, acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, every soft sigh that escaped her lips. The scent of her hair had filled his nostrils, a clean fragrance that spoke of soap and sunshine despite the harsh winter that raged outside. When morning had finally come, neither had spoken of the night they had shared. Nancy had returned to her own alcove without comment, and Ralph had gone about his daily duties as if nothing had changed. But they both had known that a line had been crossed, an intimacy acknowledged that could not be taken back. The storm had passed, but Nancy had continued to share Ralph's bed. It had become their unspoken arrangement, justified by the practical concerns of warmth and comfort, but driven by emotions that ran far deeper than mere convenience. They had learned to sleep curled together like two halves of a whole, Ralph's strong arms providing shelter while Nancy's gentle presence soothed the nightmares that had plagued him for years. "I dream of the raids sometimes," Ralph had confessed one night as they lay in the darkness listening to the wind sing through the rafters. "The faces of the people we killed, the villages we burned, they haunt me even in sleep." Nancy had turned in his arms to face him, her green eyes barely visible in the dim glow from the banked fire. "What do you see in these dreams?" "Children running from burning houses," Ralph had whispered, his voice thick with shame. "Women screaming as their husbands are cut down. Old men begging for mercy that never comes. I tell myself it was necessary, that it was the way of our people, but the dreams know the truth." Nancy's hand had found his cheek in the darkness, her thumb tracing the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "The fact that you feel remorse means you haven't lost your soul," she had said softly. "A truly evil man would sleep peacefully after such deeds." "How can you comfort me?" Ralph had asked, genuine confusion coloring his words. "Your own family died in one of our raids. Your life was destroyed by men exactly like me." Nancy had been quiet for a long moment, and Ralph had feared he had pushed too far, reminded her too starkly of the gulf that separated them. But when she finally spoke, her words had carried a wisdom that took his breath away. "Because the man who bought me to save me from rape is not the same man who participated in raids," she had said. "People can change, Ralph. They can choose to be better than they were." The conversation had ended with Nancy pressing her lips to his forehead in a kiss so gentle it might have been imagined. But Ralph had felt the warmth of it long after she had settled back into sleep, a benediction that seemed to quiet the voices of his nightmares. Spring's arrival had brought new challenges and new opportunities. The settlement had begun to stir with plans for the coming raiding season, longships being repaired and weapons being sharpened for the campaigns that would begin as soon as the ice broke up in the harbor. Ralph had found himself torn between his old life and the new one that Nancy represented, duty warring with desire in his conflicted heart. "You'll be leaving soon," Nancy had observed one morning as she watched him oil his mail shirt with practiced efficiency. There had been no accusation in her voice, but Ralph had heard the fear she tried to hide. "The raids are part of life here," he had said, though the words had tasted like ash in his mouth. "It's how we survive, how we feed our families and maintain our strength." "I know," Nancy had replied. I worry about what might happen while you're gone." Her concern had been justified, Ralph had realized. As his property, Nancy would be under his protection only as long as he remained in the settlement. Once he departed with the raiding fleet, she would be vulnerable to any man who decided to challenge his claim in his absence. "I could ask Tyler Turner to watch over you, Tim," Ralph had suggested, though the idea had sat poorly with him. Tyler was a good man and a trusted friend, but Ralph had seen how he looked at Nancy when he thought no one was watching. "Or you could take me with you," Nancy had said quietly. The suggestion had shocked Ralph into silence. Women sometimes accompanied Viking raids, but they were usually the wives or daughters of important leaders, not slaves or captives. The idea of bringing Nancy into the violence and chaos of a raiding expedition had filled him with horror. "The longships are no place for you," he had said firmly. "The raids are brutal, bloody affairs. You would see things that would haunt you forever. More than being sold into slavery already has? Nancy had asked with a bitter laugh. More than watching my village burn and my family die? Ralph had had no answer for that. Nancy had already seen the worst that his people could offer, had survived horrors that would have broken a weaker person. Perhaps she was stronger than he gave her credit for. The debate over Nancy's fate had consumed Ralph's thoughts for days. He had found himself unable to concentrate on the preparations for the upcoming raids, his mind constantly returning to the impossible choice between duty and love. To leave Nancy behind would be to abandon her to whatever mercies the settlement might offer in his absence. To take her with him would be to expose her to dangers that made their current situation seem safe by comparison. It was Heather Rogers who had provided the solution, though she had not known it at the time. The wife of one of Douglas Harris's lieutenants had approached Ralph in the market square, her weathered face creased with worry lines that spoke of many seasons spent waiting for raiding parties to return. "I hear you're torn about what to do with your woman," Heather had said without preamble, her direct manner typical of Viking wives who had learned to speak their minds in a world that valued strength above all else. "Word travels fast," Ralph had replied carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. "It does when the subject is as unusual as yours," Heather had said with a knowing smile. "A warrior who treats his slave like a wife, a captive who looks at her master like he hung the moon. People talk about such things." Ralph had felt heat rise in his cheeks at her words. He had thought their relationship was private, conducted behind the closed doors of his longhouse. But apparently their growing affection had not gone unnoticed by the settlement's residents. "What people say and what is true are often different things," he had said diplomatically. "Are they?" Heather had asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Then you won't mind leaving her behind when the longships sail?" The question had hit Ralph like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. The thought of leaving Nancy behind, of not knowing if she would be safe or even alive when he returned, was unbearable. Somewhere in the long winter months, she had become as essential to him as breathing. "I see the answer in your face," Heather had said gently. "You love her, don't you?" Ralph had wanted to deny it, to maintain the fiction that Nancy was merely property he was reluctant to lose. But under Heather's knowing gaze, the pretense had crumbled like a dam giving way to floodwaters. "Yes," he had admitted quietly. "God help me, but yes." "Then marry her," Heather had said simply. "Make her your wife in the eyes of the boys and the law. A wife has protections that a slave does not, rights that even Douglas Harris would be reluctant to challenge." The suggestion had been so obvious that Ralph had wondered why he had not thought of it himself. A marriage would change Nancy's status completely, transforming her from property into family. As Ralph's wife, she would be under the protection of his name and his sword, safe from the casual cruelties that befell unprotected women. But marriage also carried obligations and expectations that Ralph was not sure he was ready to face. A Viking wife was expected to manage the household, bear children, and maintain the family's honor while her husband was away on raids. Could Nancy, raised in a gentler culture, adapt to such demands? "She's not one of us," Ralph had said, voicing his doubts aloud. "She doesn't know our ways, our customs. The other women might not accept her." "The other women will follow my lead," Heather had replied with the confidence of one who had earned her place through years of survival and adaptation. "And I say that any woman strong enough to capture Ralph Mitchell's heart is strong enough to be a Viking wife." That evening, Ralph had returned to his longhouse, with Heather's words echoing in his mind. He had found Nancy tending the fire, her auburn hair gleaming in the flickering light as she stirred a pot of stew that filled the room with savory aromas. The domestic scene had struck him with unexpected force, a vision of the life they could have together if he was brave enough to claim it. "Nancy," he had said, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. She had looked up from her cooking, concern creasing her brow at his serious tone. "What is it? You look as if you've seen a ghost." "In a way I have," Ralph had replied, settling onto the bench beside the fire. "I've been thinking about what you said, about taking you with me on the raids." Nancy had set down her wooden spoon, giving him her full attention. "And?" I can't bear the thought of leaving you behind, Ralph had admitted. But I also can't bear the thought of exposing you to the violence that awaits us across the sea. Then what do you suggest? Nancy had asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already suspected where his thoughts were leading. Ralph had taken a deep breath, steeling himself for what might be the most important words he would ever speak. Marry me. The proposal had hung in the air between them like a challenge, bold and terrifying in its implications. Nancy's eyes had widened with surprise, her lips parting as if to speak before falling silent again. Marry you, she had repeated finally, her voice barely above a whisper. As my wife, you would have protection, status, a place in this community that no one could challenge, Ralph had explained, the words tumbling out in his eagerness to make her understand. You wouldn't have to come on the raids if you didn't want to. You could stay here, safe among the other wives, or you could choose to accompany me as some of the stronger women do. Nancy had been quiet for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames as she considered his offer. When she finally spoke, her question had cut straight to the heart of the matter. Do you love me, Ralph Mitchell? The directness of the question had stolen Ralph's breath. In all his planning and reasoning, he had focused on the practical benefits of marriage, while carefully avoiding the emotional truth that lay beneath. But Nancy deserved honesty, deserved to know that his proposal came from the heart rather than mere convenience. More than I thought possible, he had said, his voice thick with emotion. More than I deserve, given what I've done, what I've been. You've changed me, Nancy, made me remember what it feels like to be human. Tears had gathered in Nancy's eyes, but they had been tears of joy rather than sorrow. She had reached for his hands, her small fingers intertwining with his scarred knuckles in a gesture that felt like a promise. Then yes, she had whispered, yes, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed had been their first, a gentle meeting of lips that spoke of love, finally acknowledged and accepted. Ralph had felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that spread through his entire body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They had been married 3 days later in a ceremony that had surprised the entire settlement with its simplicity and sincerity. Douglas Harris had performed the ritual himself, his calculating eyes missing nothing as he bound their hands with silken cords and spoke the ancient words that made them husband and wife. You've made an interesting choice, Ralph Mitchell, Douglas had said after the ceremony, his tone carefully neutral. I hope you don't come to regret it. The only thing I regret is waiting so long, Ralph had replied, his arm around Nancy's waist as they faced the assembled crowd. The wedding feast had been modest but joyful, with even the most skeptical warriors raising their cups to toast the unlikely couple. Nancy had worn a dress of deep blue wool that Heather Rogers had helped her sew, her auburn hair crowned with wildflowers that had somehow survived the harsh northern climate. But it was the look in her eyes that had taken Ralph's breath away, a radiance that transformed her from beautiful to luminous. She had looked at him as if he were her salvation rather than her captor, as if their marriage was the fulfillment of dreams rather than the acceptance of necessity. That night they had consummated their union with a tenderness that neither had expected. Ralph had been gentle, mindful of Nancy's inexperience and the trauma she had endured. Nancy had been trusting, offering herself to him with a vulnerability that humbled his warrior's heart. I never thought I could feel safe in a man's arms again, she had whispered afterward as they lay entwined in the darkness. But with you, I feel like I'm home. Ralph had held her close, marveling at the miracle of their love. A year ago he had been nothing more than another Viking raider, his heart as cold as the northern seas. Now he was a husband, a protector, a man who had found redemption in the love of a woman he had helped to capture. The weeks following their marriage had been the happiest of Ralph's life. Nancy had embraced her new role as his wife with a grace that had impressed even the most skeptical members of the community. She had learned to manage their household with efficiency, mastering the skills of preservation and preparation that would keep them fed through the long winter months. More importantly, she had begun to find her place among the other Viking women. Heather Rogers had taken her under her wing, teaching her the customs and expectations that governed their society. Laura Harris, Douglas's own wife, had extended grudging acceptance that gradually warmed into genuine friendship. She's not what I expected, Laura had confided to Ralph one afternoon as they watched Nancy help organize the spring planting. When I heard you had married your slave, I thought you had lost your mind. But she's proven herself to be stronger than most of the women born to our ways. Ralph had felt a surge of pride at the praise. Nancy had indeed proven herself, earning respect through her actions rather than demanding it through her status. She had tended the sick during a fever outbreak, helped mediate disputes between feuding families, and contributed to the community's welfare in countless small ways. But it was her effect on Ralph himself that had drawn the most attention. The other warriors had noticed the change in him, the way his legendary temper had cooled and his harsh edges had softened. He still fought with the same skill and fury that had made him famous, but there was a new purpose to his violence, a protectiveness that extended beyond mere survival. "Marriage suits you," Tyler Turner had observed one evening as they shared ale in the Great Hall. "I've never seen you so content." Content, Ralph had repeated, testing the word on his tongue. It was not a concept he had ever associated with himself. But Tyler was right. Despite the uncertainties that lay ahead, despite the challenges that marriage in their harsh world would bring, Ralph had found a peace he had never known existed. The approaching raiding season had cast a shadow over their happiness, but it was a shadow they faced together. Nancy had made her choice to accompany Ralph on the upcoming expedition, despite the dangers and hardships it would entail. "I won't be separated from you so soon after finding you," she had declared when Ralph had tried once more to dissuade her. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Her determination had both thrilled and terrified him. The upcoming raid would take them to the coast of Ireland, where rich monasteries and prosperous towns offered tempting targets for Viking longships. But the Irish had grown wise to Viking tactics over the years, and their resistance had become fiercer with each passing season. The night before their departure, Ralph and Nancy had walked along the shore beneath a canopy of stars that seemed to stretch into infinity. The longships rode at anchor in the harbor, their dragon prows pointing toward the horizon like arrows aimed at destiny. "Are you afraid?" Ralph had asked, his arm around Nancy's shoulders as they stood on the rocky beach. "Terrified," Nancy had admitted honestly, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of living without you if something happens." Ralph had understood exactly what she meant. Death held no terror for a Viking warrior, but the thought of Nancy facing the world alone, of her light being extinguished by the darkness that surrounded them, was unbearable. "Nothing will happen to us," he had said, though they both knew such promises were meaningless in the face of fate. "We'll survive this together, just as we've survived everything else." Nancy had turned in his arms then, her green eyes reflecting the starlight as she studied his face. "Promise me something," she had said. "Anything. If something does happen to me, don't let it turn you back into the man you were before. Don't let my death undo all the good we've found together." The request had been like a dagger to Ralph's heart, but he had nodded his agreement. Nancy deserved that promise, deserved to know that their love would endure even if she did not. They had made love that night with desperate passion, as if they could somehow hold back the dawn through the intensity of their desire. Ralph had memorized every curve of Nancy's body, every sigh that escaped her lips, storing up sensations against the possibility that they might be their last. When morning had come, they had boarded the longship with the other raiders, Nancy taking her place among the handful of women who had chosen to accompany their men into battle. She had worn leather armor that Heather Rogers had helped her acquire, her auburn hair braided in the Viking fashion, and her green eyes bright with determination. The voyage across the North Sea had been rough but uneventful, the longships cutting through the gray waters like knives through silk. Nancy had proven herself to be a capable sailor, helping with the rigging and taking her turn at the oars without complaint. The other raiders had begun to accept her presence, impressed by her willingness to share in their hardships. It was on the third day of their journey that they had encountered the Irish warships. The enemy vessels had appeared on the horizon like dark clouds, their sails billowing as they raced to intercept the Viking fleet. Ralph had felt his blood quicken at the sight, the familiar rush of impending battle coursing through his veins like fire. "Stay close to me," he had commanded Nancy, checking the straps of her armor one final time. "No matter what happens, don't leave my side." Nancy had nodded, her face pale but resolute as she gripped the handle of the sayax he had given her for protection. She had never killed a man, but Ralph had seen the steel in her eyes and knew she would do what was necessary to survive. The battle had been fierce and chaotic, long ships ramming into each other with bone-jarring force, while warriors leaped across the gaps to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Ralph had fought like a man possessed, his sword cutting down anyone who threatened to reach Nancy's position. But in the confusion of battle, they had been separated. Ralph had been engaged with 3 Irish warriors when he had heard Nancy scream his name. He had turned to see her struggling with a massive Irishman who had cornered her against the ship's rail, his meaty hands reaching for her throat while she slashed desperately with her sayax. The sight had triggered something primal in Ralph, a rage that went beyond normal battle fury. He had carved through his opponents like wheat before a scythe, his sword singing as it cleaved flesh and bone. But even as he fought to reach her, he had seen the Irishman's club descending toward Nancy's head. The blow had connected with a sickening crack, and Nancy had crumpled to the deck like a broken doll. Ralph's roar of anguish had echoed across the water as he finally reached her attacker, his sword taking the man's head from his shoulders in a single devastating stroke. The battle had ended soon after. The Irish ships either sunk or fled. But Ralph had barely noticed the victory, his attention focused entirely on Nancy's still form as he cradled her in his arms. Blood had seeped from the wound on her temple, and her breathing had been shallow and irregular. "Nancy," he had whispered, his voice breaking with desperation. "Nancy, stay with me." But she had not responded, lost in the darkness that had claimed her when the club had found its mark. The journey back to the settlement had been the longest of Ralph's life. Nancy had remained unconscious despite his desperate attempts to wake her body limp and unresponsive in his arms. The ship's healer, an old woman named Donna Wright, had done what she could with herbs and poultices, but her grim expression had told Ralph everything he needed to know. "Head wounds are tricky things," Donna had said as she cleaned the blood from Nancy's temple. "Sometimes people wake up from them as if nothing happened. Sometimes they never wake up at all." Ralph had refused to leave Nancy's side during the voyage home, holding her close and whispering stories of their life together, hoping that somehow his voice might reach her through the darkness that held her captive. He had told her about the house he wanted to build for them, with windows that faced the morning sun and a garden where she could grow the flowers she loved. "You can't leave me now," he had pleaded as the longship cut through the waves toward home. "Not when we've just found each other. Not when we have so much life left to live." But Nancy had remained silent and still, her breathing the only sign that life still flickered within her battered body. The other raiders had given Ralph space to grieve, understanding that their fierce companion was facing a battle more terrible than any they had fought on Irish shores. Even Douglas Harris had shown uncharacteristic compassion, ensuring that Nancy received the best care available and that Ralph was not disturbed in his vigil. "She's a fighter," Tyler Turner had said as he sat beside Ralph during one of the long nights at sea. "If anyone can come back from this, it's her." Ralph had wanted to believe his friend's words, but with each passing hour his hope had grown dimmer. Nancy's skin had grown pale and cold despite the furs that covered her, and her breathing had become even more labored. When they had finally reached the settlement's harbor, Ralph had carried Nancy to their longhouse with infinite care, as if any sudden movement might shatter what remained of her life. He had laid her on their bed, surrounded her with the softest furs and the warmest blankets, and begun the hardest wait of his life. Days had passed without change. Ralph had barely eaten, had not slept for more than a few minutes at a time, his entire existence focused on the rise and fall of Nancy's chest. Heather Rogers and the other women had brought food and offered comfort, but Ralph had been inconsolable in his grief. "She's in the hands of the cause now," Heather had said gently. "All we can do is wait and pray." But Ralph had never been good at waiting, and prayer felt like surrender to a man who had spent his life taking what he wanted by force. He had raged at his helplessness, at the cruel irony that had brought Nancy into his life, only to threaten to take her away again. It was on the 7th night after their return that Nancy had finally stirred. Ralph had been dozing fitfully in the chair beside the bed when he heard her moan softly. His eyes had snapped open to find her green eyes fluttering, her head moving slightly on the pillow. "Nancy," he had whispered, afraid to hope. Her eyes had focused on his face with obvious effort. confusion clouding her features as she tried to remember where she was and what had happened. "Ralph?" she had said, her voice barely audible. The sound of his name on her lips had been the most beautiful music Ralph had ever heard. He had taken her hand in his, feeling the warmth of her fingers as they squeezed his with surprising strength. "I'm here," he had said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You're safe. You're home." Nancy had tried to sit up, but Ralph had gently pressed her back onto the pillows. "Easy," he had cautioned. "You've been unconscious for days. You need to rest." "The battle," Nancy had said, memory returning in fragments. "The Irish ships. I remember fighting and then you nearly died," Ralph had finished, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I had lost you." Nancy had reached up to touch the bandage on her head, wincing at the tenderness of the wound. "But you didn't," she had said with a weak smile. "I'm too stubborn to die so easily." Ralph had laughed through his tears, overwhelmed by relief and joy. And Nancy was alive, was speaking and thinking clearly despite the severity of her injury. Whatever damage the blow had done, it had not stolen the essence of who she was. The days that followed had been a gradual return to normalcy. Nancy's strength had returned slowly but steadily, her appetite improving and her color returning to normal. The settlement's healer had pronounced her recovery miraculous, though she had warned that head wounds could have lingering effects that might not manifest for weeks or months. But Ralph had not cared about future possibilities. Nancy was alive, was healing, and that was all that mattered. He had devoted himself to her care with the same intensity he had once brought to battle, ensuring she had everything she needed to recover fully. "You don't have to hover over me like a mother hen," Nancy had teased one afternoon as Ralph fussed over her blankets for the third time in an hour. "I nearly lost you," Ralph had replied seriously. "I'm not taking any chances." Nancy had reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You didn't lose me," she had said, "and you're not going to. We're bound together now, Ralph Mitchell, in ways that go deeper than marriage vows or legal contracts. Death itself couldn't separate us." Her words had carried a conviction that went beyond mere hope or wishful thinking. Nancy believed what she was saying with every fiber of her being, and her certainty had infected Ralph with the same unshakable faith. "I love you," he had said, the words coming easier now after nearly losing the chance to speak them. "And I love you," Nancy had replied. "More than I ever thought possible." As Nancy's recovery had progressed, they had begun to talk about their future with new urgency. The brush with death had reminded them both how precious and fragile their happiness was, how quickly it could be snatched away by the cruel realities of their world. "I want children," Nancy had confessed one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting on Ralph's shoulder. "I want to fill this house with laughter and love, to create something beautiful in the midst of all this harshness." Ralph had felt his heart swell at her words. The idea of children, of a family built on love, rather than mere survival, had seemed like an impossible dream just months ago. But with Nancy by his side, anything seemed possible. "How many?" he had asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "As many as the gods see fit to bless us with," Nancy had replied. "Sons who will grow up to be better men than their father's generation. Daughters who will know they are valued for more than their ability to bear children." Ralph had marveled at her vision of the future, at her ability to see hope and possibility where he had once seen only struggle and survival. Nancy was transforming not just him, but his entire understanding of what life could be. "And what of the raids?" he had asked. "They're part of life here, part of how we survive." Nancy had been quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "I won't ask you to abandon your people or your duties," she had said finally. "But perhaps there are other ways to ensure our survival. Trade instead of raids, cooperation instead of conquest." The suggestion had been radical, almost heretical in their warrior culture. But Ralph had found himself considering it seriously, imagining a world where Vikings were known for their craftsmanship and seamanship rather than their violence and pillaging. It would take generations to change, he had said, and not everyone would accept such a transformation. "All great changes begin with a single person willing to try something different," Nancy had replied. "Maybe we could be that beginning." The conversation about their future had planted a seed in Ralph's mind that grew stronger with each passing day. He found himself observing the settlement with new eyes, seeing the waste and inefficiency that came from their constant focus on raiding and warfare. So much energy was spent on violence that could have been channeled into building something lasting and beautiful. Nancy's recovery had been remarkably swift, defying the healer's cautious predictions. Within a month of the battle, she had been back on her feet and resuming her duties as Ralph's wife. But the experience had changed her, adding a new depth to her already considerable strength. "I dreamed while I was unconscious," she had told Ralph one night as they prepared for bed. "Strange, vivid dreams that felt more real than waking life." "What did you dream about?" Ralph had asked, intrigued by the distant look in her eyes. "I saw our children," Nancy had said softly. "Three of them, two boys and a girl. They were playing in a garden filled with flowers I've never seen before, laughing as they chased butterflies through the sunlight." The image she painted had been so vivid that Ralph could almost see it himself. Children with Nancy's green eyes and his strong jaw, growing up in a world where violence was the exception rather than the rule. "And," he had prompted when she fell silent. "And I saw you teaching them," Nancy had continued, "not how to fight or kill, but how to build things. Beautiful things that would last long after we're gone." Ralph had felt something shift in his chest at her words, a longing for a life he had never dared to imagine. The idea of leaving a legacy of creation rather than destruction appealed to him in ways he couldn't fully explain. "It was just a dream," he had said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Was it?" Nancy had asked, turning to face him in the darkness. "Or was it a vision of what could be?" The question had haunted Ralph for days afterward. He found himself watching the settlement's craftsmen with new interest, marveling at the skill of the blacksmiths and woodworkers who created the tools and weapons that made their society function. These men were builders rather than destroyers, their work adding value to the world rather than taking it away. It was during one of these observations that Ralph had encountered Hannah Alvarez, the settlement's most skilled weaver. The elderly woman had been working at her loom, creating a tapestry of stunning complexity and beauty. "It's magnificent," Ralph had said, genuinely impressed by the intricate patterns and vibrant colors. Hannah had looked up from her work with surprise. Warriors rarely took interest in such domestic arts, considering them beneath their notice. "Thank you," she had said, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "It tells the story of our people, from the first longships to the present day." Ralph had studied the tapestry more closely, seeing their history rendered in thread and dye. But what struck him most was how Hannah had chosen to portray that history. Instead of focusing solely on battles and conquests, she had included scenes of daily life, of families and festivals, of the quieter moments that made up the bulk of human existence. "You see us differently than most," Ralph had observed. "I see us as we truly are," Hannah had replied. "Warriors, yes, but also farmers and craftsmen, fathers and mothers, people trying to build lives worth living in a harsh world." Her words had resonated deeply with Ralph, confirming what Nancy had been trying to tell him about the possibility of change. Their people were more than just raiders and killers. They had the capacity for creation and beauty, for lives built on something more substantial than violence. That evening, Ralph had shared his conversation with Hannah with Nancy, who had listened with growing excitement as he described the weaver's perspective on their society. "She understands what I've been trying to say," Nancy had said when he finished. "We don't have to be defined by our worst impulses. We can choose to be better." "But how?" Ralph had asked. "How do we begin to change something as fundamental as our way of life?" Nancy had been quiet for a moment, her green eyes reflecting the firelight as she considered the question. When she spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone who had found her purpose. "We start with ourselves," she had said. "We live differently, love differently, raise our children differently. We become an example of what's possible and hope that others will be inspired to follow." The simplicity of her answer had been both beautiful and terrifying. Change on such a fundamental level would require courage, persistence, and a willingness to face opposition from those who profited from the current system. "Douglas Harris won't appreciate such ideas," Ralph had warned. "He's built his power on our reputation as fearsome raiders. Any suggestion that we should become peaceful traders would be seen as a threat to his authority. Then we'll have to be careful, Nancy had replied. We'll have to plant seeds quietly and let them grow in their own time. Over the following weeks, Ralph had begun to put Nancy's philosophy into practice in small ways. He had started spending more time with the settlement's craftsmen, learning their techniques and offering his own insights based on his travels. He had begun to see their work not as mere necessities, but as expressions of human creativity and skill. The blacksmith, Anthony Lopez, had been particularly welcoming of Ralph's interest. The stocky craftsman had been delighted to find a warrior who appreciated the artistry involved in creating a perfect blade, not just its effectiveness in battle. Most of your kind see only the weapon, Anthony had said, as he demonstrated the intricate process of folding steel. They don't understand that each blade is unique, that it carries something of its maker's soul. Ralph had watched in fascination as Anthony had worked, seeing parallels between the smith's careful craftsmanship and his own growing desire to create rather than destroy. The blade that emerged from the forge had been a thing of beauty as well as utility, its surface rippling with patterns that caught the light like water. "Could you teach me?" Ralph had asked impulsively. Anthony had paused in his work, surprise evident on his soot-stained face. "You want to learn smithing?" "I want to learn to make something that will last," Ralph had replied, the words coming from somewhere deep in his chest. Something beautiful. The lessons that followed had been a revelation. Ralph had discovered that he had a natural aptitude for the work, his warrior's strength and precision serving him well at the forge. More importantly, he had found a peace in the rhythmic hammering and shaping that he had never experienced in battle. Nancy had been delighted by his new interest, seeing it as confirmation of the change she had sensed growing within him. She had often joined him at the forge, watching as he worked and offering encouragement when frustration threatened to overwhelm him. "You're creating something from nothing," she had observed one afternoon as Ralph had struggled with a particularly difficult piece. "Bringing order out of chaos, beauty out of raw metal. It's like watching magic." Her words had given Ralph a new perspective on his work. He had begun to see smithing not just as a craft, but as a form of alchemy that transformed base materials into something greater than the sum of their parts. It was during one of these sessions that Douglas Harris had made his unexpected appearance at the forge. The raid leader had entered without announcement, his cold eyes taking in the scene with calculating interest. Ralph had been working on a decorative bowl, its surface covered with intricate knotwork patterns, while Nancy had been sorting through finished pieces with obvious admiration. "How domestic," Douglas had said, his tone carrying just enough edge to make it sound like an insult. Ralph had set down his hammer carefully, turning to face the man who held so much power over their community. "Douglas, what brings you to the forge?" "Curiosity," Douglas had replied, his gaze moving from Ralph to Nancy and back again. "I've been hearing interesting reports about your new interests. Some might say that a warrior who spends his time making pretty trinkets has lost his edge." The challenge in Douglas's words had been unmistakable, but Ralph had refused to rise to the bait. Instead, he had picked up the bowl he had been working on, holding it up to the light so that the patterns caught the glow from the forge. "Beauty and strength aren't mutually exclusive," Ralph had said calmly. "A warrior who understands creation as well as destruction is more complete than one who knows only how to take." Douglas had laughed, but there had been no humor in the sound. "Philosophy from a blacksmith's apprentice. How the mighty have fallen." Nancy had stepped forward then, her chin raised in defiance despite the obvious danger in challenging Douglas directly. "Perhaps the mighty have risen," she had said, her voice steady and clear. "Perhaps they've found something worth building instead of just something worth tearing down." The silence that followed had been electric with tension. Douglas had stared at Nancy with the kind of cold calculation that preceded violence, while Ralph had felt his muscles tense in preparation for whatever might come next. But then, unexpectedly, Douglas had smiled. "Interesting," he had said, his tone shifting from threatening to merely thoughtful. "Very interesting, indeed." Without another word, he had turned and left the forge, leaving Ralph and Nancy to wonder what his cryptic response had meant. The encounter with Douglas Harris had marked a turning point in Ralph and Nancy's relationship with the settlement's power structure. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly through the community, dividing opinion between those who admired Ralph's courage and those who saw his new interest as a sign of weakness. Tyler Turner had been among the first to express his concerns, cornering Ralph near the harbor where the longships rested at anchor, like sleeping dragons. "You're walking a dangerous path," Tyler had warned, his scarred face creased with worry. "Douglas doesn't tolerate challenges to his authority, even indirect ones." "I'm not challenging anyone," Ralph had replied, though they both knew the statement wasn't entirely true. "I'm simply exploring new possibilities." "New possibilities that threaten the old ways," Tyler had countered. "The raids are what keep us strong, what give us the resources we need to survive. If you convince people that there's another way, you undermine the very foundation of our society." Ralph had understood his friend's concerns, but he had also seen the fear that lay beneath them. Tyler, like so many of the other warriors, had built his identity around violence and conquest. The suggestion that there might be other paths to strength and prosperity threatened everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. "What if the old ways are leading us toward destruction?" Ralph had asked. "What if our reputation for violence is making more enemies than we can handle?" Tyler had been quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where storm clouds were gathering. When he spoke again, his voice had carried a weariness that spoke of too many battles and too many losses. "Maybe you're right," he had admitted reluctantly. "Maybe we are heading towards something we can't survive. But what choice do we have? This is the only life we know." "It doesn't have to be," Ralph had said gently. "People can learn new skills, find new purposes. The same courage that makes a great warrior can make a great craftsman or trader." The conversation had ended without resolution, but Ralph had seen something shift in Tyler's expression, a crack in the certainty that had always defined him. Change was possible, even for those who seemed most set in their ways. Nancy had been working to create similar cracks in the certainty of the settlement's women. Her recovery from the head wound had given her a kind of mystique among them, as if surviving such an injury had marked her as someone touched by fate. She had used that influence carefully, planting seeds of new ideas in conversations about children and families. "What if our sons didn't have to choose between being warriors or being weak?" she had asked during one of the women's gatherings where they worked on communal projects. "What if we taught them that true strength comes from building rather than destroying?" The suggestion had been met with skeptical silence at first, but Nancy had persisted, sharing stories of the craftsmen and traders she had known in her homeland, men who were respected for their skills and wisdom rather than their prowess in battle. Heather Rogers had been among the first to warm to Nancy's ideas, perhaps because her own son was approaching the age where he would be expected to take up arms. "I've seen too many good boys turned into broken men by the raids," Heather had confided to Nancy after one of these gatherings. "If there was another way, a better way, I'd want it for my child." Laura Harris, Douglas's wife, had been more resistant to change, but even she had shown signs of wavering when Nancy had spoken about the dreams she'd had while unconscious. "You really saw our future?" Laura had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw a possible future," Nancy had replied carefully. "One where our children grew up knowing peace as well as war, where they had choices about the kinds of lives they wanted to live." These conversations had been taking place against the backdrop of increasing tension within the settlement. Douglas Harris had been watching Ralph and Nancy's activities with growing suspicion, his network of informants keeping him apprised of every conversation and every small act of rebellion against the established order. The confrontation that everyone had been expecting had finally come on a gray morning in early summer, when Douglas had summoned Ralph to the great hall for what he had termed a private discussion. Ralph had found the raid leader seated in his carved chair, flanked by his most loyal supporters. The arrangement had been clearly intended to intimidate, to remind Ralph of his place in the settlement's hierarchy. "Sit," Douglas had commanded, gesturing to a simple wooden stool that had been placed in front of his chair like a defendant's dock. Ralph had remained standing, his refusal to be cowed earning him nods of approval from some of the assembled warriors and frowns of disapproval from others. "I've been hearing disturbing reports," Douglas had begun, his cold eyes never leaving Ralph's face. "Talk of new ways and better paths, suggestions that our traditional methods are somehow flawed." People are entitled to their opinions, Ralph had replied evenly. Not when those opinions threaten the stability of our community, Douglas had shot back. You're spreading dangerous ideas, Ralph Mitchell. Ideas that could get us all killed. How is learning new skills dangerous? Ralph had asked. How is creating beauty instead of destruction a threat to anyone? Douglas had leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Because it makes us soft. Because it makes us forget who we are and what we're capable of. Our enemies fear us because they know we're willing to do whatever it takes to survive. If we lose that reputation, if we become known as peaceful traders and craftsmen, how long do you think it will be before they decide we're easy prey? The argument had been one Ralph had expected, and he had prepared his response carefully. Fear is a tool, but it's not the only tool. Respect can be just as powerful, and it lasts longer. A trader who keeps his word is welcomed wherever he goes. A raider is met with swords and shields. Pretty words, Douglas had sneered. But words don't fill bellies or build long ships. The raids provide us with the resources we need to survive. Your peaceful alternatives are luxuries we can't afford. Are they? Ralph had challenged. Or have we simply never tried to find out what else might be possible? The question had hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Douglas had stared at Ralph with undisguised hatred, his hand moving instinctively toward the hilt of his sword. But before violence could erupt, Nancy had entered the great hall. She had walked through the assembled warriors with quiet dignity, her green eyes fixed on Ralph as if no one else existed. The sight of her had diffused the tension slightly, reminding everyone present that this was not just about abstract philosophy, but about real people and real relationships. My husband is needed at home, Nancy had said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. Our evening meal grows cold. Douglas had looked from Nancy to Ralph and back again, his calculating mind working through the implications of forcing a confrontation in front of the entire community. Finally, he had waved his hand dismissively. Go, he had said, but remember what we've discussed, Ralph Mitchell. Remember where your loyalties should lie. Ralph had taken Nancy's arm and escorted her from the hall, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon them as they left. Once they were safely outside, Nancy had sagged against him with relief. I was so afraid, she had whispered. When I heard you'd been summoned, I thought, I know, Ralph had said, holding her close. But it's not over. Douglas isn't going to let this go. They had both known that the confrontation had been just the beginning, that Douglas would be watching for any excuse to move against them. But they had also known that there was no going back, that they had committed themselves to a path that would either lead to transformation or destruction. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind howl around their longhouse, Nancy had voiced the question that had been haunting them both. Do you think we're being foolish? She had asked. Trying to change something so fundamental, so entrenched? Ralph had been quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. When he spoke, his voice had carried the conviction of a man who had found his purpose. Maybe, he had admitted, but some things are worth being foolish for. Love is worth being foolish for. Hope is worth being foolish for. The chance to leave the world better than we found it is worth any risk. Nancy had turned in his arms then, her lips finding his in the darkness. Their kiss had been gentle, but passionate, a reaffirmation of their commitment to each other and to the future they were trying to create. The weeks following the confrontation in the Great Hall had been marked by a subtle but unmistakable shift in the settlement's atmosphere. Lines were being drawn, allegiances tested, as people chose sides in the growing conflict between tradition and change. Ralph had continued his work at the forge, but now his activities were watched constantly by Douglas's supporters. Every conversation was scrutinized, every interaction analyzed for signs of sedition or rebellion. The pressure had been intense, but it had also served to clarify who could be trusted and who could not. Anthony Lopez, the blacksmith, had proven to be a valuable ally, his respect for craftsmanship making him naturally sympathetic to Ralph's vision of a different future. Several of the younger warriors had also shown interest in learning new skills, their curiosity overcoming their fear of challenging established norms. But it was the women who had proven most receptive to change. Led by Nancy and Heather Rogers, They had begun to organize themselves into something resembling a movement, sharing ideas about child rearing and family life that diverged significantly from traditional Viking practices. "We're raising the next generation," Nancy had said during one of their gatherings. "We have the power to shape what kind of people they become, what kind of world they'll create." The influence of these women had begun to extend beyond their immediate families. Children throughout the settlement had started to hear different stories, different messages about what it meant to be strong and successful. Instead of tales that glorified violence and conquest, they were hearing about heroes who built cities and created beautiful things. Douglas Harris had not been blind to these developments. His network of informants had kept him well informed about the growing influence of what he had begun to call the soft faction. His response had been characteristically direct and brutal. The first sign of his displeasure had come when several families had found their food rations reduced, their access to communal resources restricted. The message had been clear. Those who challenged the established order would face consequences. But instead of backing down, the affected families had banded together, sharing what they had and supporting each other through the artificial hardship. Their solidarity had only strengthened their resolve and attracted more supporters to their cause. The situation had reached a breaking point on the night of the summer solstice, when the entire settlement had gathered for the traditional feast and celebration. What should have been a time of unity and joy had instead become an arena for the competing visions of their society's future. Douglas had used the occasion to deliver a speech that had been both a rallying cry for his supporters and a thinly veiled threat to his opponents. "We are Vikings," he had declared, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "We are the sons and daughters of Odin, born to conquest and glory. Our ancestors would weep to see us reduced to merchants and craftsmen, trading our birthright for the illusion of peace." The speech had been met with enthusiastic cheers from about half the crowd, while the other half had remained conspicuously silent. The division within the community had never been more apparent or more dangerous. When Douglas had finished speaking, Ralph had found himself rising to his feet, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite name. Nancy had tried to pull him back down, sensing the danger in the moment, but Ralph had gently freed himself from her grasp. "May I speak?" he had asked, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. Douglas had smiled, but there had been no warmth in the expression. "Of course," he had said. "Let us hear what the blacksmith's apprentice has to say about our heritage." Ralph had walked to the center of the gathering, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. When he spoke, his voice had been calm but powerful, carrying the authority of a man who had found his truth. "I am also the son of Vikings," he had begun. "My ancestors sailed these same seas, fought these same battles, but they were more than just warriors. They were explorers and traders, craftsmen and storytellers. They built settlements that lasted for generations, created art that still inspires wonder." He had paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Yes, we are capable of great violence, but we are also capable of great beauty. The question is not whether we can destroy, but whether we can create something worth preserving." The speech had been brief but powerful, its impact evident in the faces of those who heard it. Some had nodded in agreement, while others had scowled with disapproval. But all had been forced to consider the possibility that their identity as Vikings could encompass more than just warfare and raiding. Douglas's response had been swift and decisive. Before Ralph could return to his seat, the raid leader had signaled to his supporters, who had moved to surround the would-be reformer. "Enough," Douglas had said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation that had followed Ralph's speech. "I've heard enough pretty words and dangerous ideas. It's time to settle this matter once and for all." The challenge had been issued in the traditional way, with Douglas drawing his sword and pointing it at Ralph's chest. The ancient laws of their people demanded that such challenges be answered, that disputes between warriors be settled through combat. Ralph had felt a familiar calm descend upon him as he faced the prospect of battle. This was territory he knew well, skills he had honed through years of conflict and survival. But as his hand had moved toward his own sword, he had caught sight of Nancy's face in the crowd. The terror in her eyes had stopped him cold. Not fear for herself, but fear for him, for what would happen if he allowed himself to be drawn back into the cycle of violence he had been trying to escape. "I won't fight you, Douglas," Ralph had said quietly, his hand falling away from his weapon. The words had sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. In their warrior culture, refusing a direct challenge was tantamount to admitting cowardice, a shame that would follow a man for the rest of his life. Douglas had smiled triumphantly, sensing victory within his grasp. "Then you admit your weakness," he had declared. "You acknowledge that your soft ideas have no place among true Vikings." But Ralph had shaken his head, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "I admit nothing except that I've found something more important than proving my strength through violence. I've found love, in purpose, in a vision of what we could become if we chose courage over fear." The crowd had been silent, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. It was Nancy who had broken the deadlock, stepping forward to stand beside her husband with quiet dignity. "If you want to fight my husband," she had said, her voice clear and unwavering, "you'll have to go through me first." Her words had electrified the gathering, transforming what had been a simple challenge between warriors into something far more complex and dangerous. Douglas had stared at Nancy with undisguised fury, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. But before he could respond, other voices had joined Nancy's. Heather Rogers had stepped forward, followed by Anthony Lopez, then Tyler Turner, and finally dozens of others who had been inspired by Ralph and Nancy's vision of a different future. "And me," they had said, one after another, until Douglas found himself facing not just two people, but an entire community that had chosen change over tradition, hope over fear. The confrontation had ended not with violence, but with Douglas's retreat, the raid leader and his remaining supporters withdrawing from the feast in defeat. The revolution had been won not through force of arms, but through the power of shared conviction and mutual support. In the months that followed the summer solstice confrontation, the settlement had undergone a transformation that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Douglas Harris and his most loyal supporters had departed on what they claimed was an extended raiding expedition, but everyone knew they were unlikely to return. With the old guard gone, Ralph and Nancy had found themselves at the center of a community eager to explore new possibilities. The changes had been gradual but profound, touching every aspect of daily life. The forge had become a center of learning and innovation, with warriors setting aside their swords to learn the arts of metalworking and jewelry making. Anthony Lopez had proven to be an excellent teacher, his patience and skill helping to transform fighters into craftsmen. The women had established new traditions around child rearing, emphasizing creativity and problem-solving alongside physical courage. Children who once would have been trained only for war were now learning to read and write, to work with their hands, to see beauty in the world around them. Trade relationships had begun to develop with neighboring settlements, as word spread that the Vikings of their community were more interested in commerce than conquest. Merchants who had once avoided their shores now arrived regularly, bringing goods and ideas from distant lands. Nancy had thrown herself into these changes with characteristic determination, but it was her pregnancy that had truly symbolized the new direction of their community. When she had told Ralph the news on a crisp autumn morning, he had felt as if his heart might burst with joy. "A child," he had whispered, his large hands resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child. The first of the new generation," Nancy had replied, her green eyes bright with tears of happiness. "A child who will grow up knowing that strength comes in many forms, that there are many ways to be a hero." The pregnancy had progressed smoothly, with Nancy maintaining her active role in the community's transformation, even as her body changed to accommodate new life. She had become a symbol of hope for many of the settlement's residents, living proof that their new way of life could sustain and nurture future generations. Ralph had been protective but not overbearing, understanding that Nancy needed to remain active and engaged to be truly happy. He had continued his own work at the forge, creating increasingly elaborate pieces that combined function with beauty in ways that amazed even experienced craftsmen. It was during one of these work sessions that Tyler Turner had approached him with an unexpected request. "Teach me," Tyler had said without preamble, his scarred face serious but hopeful. "Teach you what?" Ralph had asked. though he suspected he already knew the answer. Everything, Tyler had replied. How to make something instead of just destroying it. How to find purpose beyond the next battle. The conversation that followed had been one of the most meaningful of Ralph's life. Tyler had confessed his growing dissatisfaction with the warrior's path, his desire to find something more substantial and lasting than the temporary glory of victory in battle. I'm getting older, Tyler had said as he watched Ralph shape a piece of heated metal. My reflexes aren't what they were. My strength is beginning to fade. But you found a way to remain valuable, to contribute something meaningful regardless of age or physical condition. Ralph had understood exactly what his friend meant. The skills of a craftsman only improve with age and experience, while a warrior's abilities inevitably declined. The path Ralph had chosen offered not just immediate satisfaction, but long-term security and purpose. The lessons that followed had been challenging but rewarding for both men. Tyler had proven to be an eager student, his warrior's discipline serving him well as he learned the patience and precision required for fine metalwork. As winter had approached, the community had prepared for the cold months with an optimism that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Instead of hoarding resources and preparing for raids, they had focused on stockpiling materials for craft projects and planning educational programs for the long nights ahead. Nancy's pregnancy had advanced smoothly through these preparations, her growing belly a constant reminder of the future they were all working to create. Ralph had found himself talking to the unborn child during quiet moments, sharing his hopes and dreams for the world they would inherit. You'll grow up in a place where strength is measured not by how much you can destroy, but by how much you can create, he had whispered one evening as Nancy slept peacefully beside him. You'll have choices we never had, opportunities we never dreamed of. The birth had come on a night when the northern lights danced across the sky in brilliant sheets of green and gold. Nancy had labored with characteristic strength and determination, supported by the community of women who had become her sisters in every way that mattered. Ralph had paced outside their longhouse like a caged wolf, his usual composure shattered by the sounds of his wife's struggle. It had been Heather Rogers who had finally emerged with the news he had been desperate to hear. You have a son, she had announced, her weathered face creased with joy. A beautiful, healthy son. Ralph had rushed inside to find Nancy cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft furs. The baby's eyes had been closed, his small fists waving in the air as he adjusted to his new environment. He's perfect, Nancy had whispered, her voice hoarse from labor but filled with wonder. Ralph had reached out with trembling fingers to touch his son's face, marveling at the softness of the skin and the delicate features that seemed to combine the best of both parents. What shall we call him? He had asked. Nancy had smiled, her green eyes bright with love and exhaustion. I dreamed of this moment while I was unconscious after the battle, she had said. I saw him clearly, saw the man he would become. His name is Eric, and he will be the first of many to grow up free from the old ways. As Ralph had held his son for the first time, feeling the tiny weight of new life in his arms, he had understood that everything had led to this moment. All the violence and pain, all the struggle and change had been necessary steps on the path to this perfect instant of peace and love. The settlement had celebrated Eric's birth with a joy that transcended individual families or personal relationships. This child represented their collective future, their shared hope for a world where children could grow up knowing security and love rather than fear and violence. In the weeks that followed, Ralph had watched in amazement as his son grew and changed, each day bringing new developments and discoveries. But it was the way the entire community had embraced Eric that truly moved him. Warriors who had once known only how to kill had learned to be gentle with the baby. Craftsmen had competed to create toys and clothing for him, and the women had taken turns helping Nancy with the demanding task of caring for a newborn. This is what we were meant to be, Nancy had said one evening as they watched Eric sleep peacefully in his cradle. Not just survivors, but nurturers. Not just takers, but givers. Ralph had nodded, understanding that their transformation was complete. They had become something new, something better than what they had been before. The Viking settlement that had once been known for its fierce raiders was now becoming famous for its skilled craftsmen and fair traders. As spring returned to their northern home, bringing with it the promise of new growth and new possibilities, Ralph and Nancy had stood together on the shore where their long ships rested at anchor. But these vessels were no longer instruments of war. They had been converted for trade and exploration, their dragon prows now symbols of curiosity rather than conquest. "Do you ever regret it?" Nancy had asked as they watched Eric sleep in her arms. "Giving up the old ways? Choosing this path instead?" Ralph had considered the question seriously, thinking of all they had sacrificed and all they had gained. When he answered, his voice had carried the certainty of a man who had found his true purpose. "Never, Ito," he had said firmly. "We've found something worth more than gold or glory. We've found a way to live that honors both our strength and our humanity." Nancy had smiled, shifting Eric to one arm so she could take Ralph's hand with the other. "Then we've succeeded beyond our wildest dreams." As they stood together watching the sunset over the water that had once carried them to war, Ralph had felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. They had transformed not just themselves but their entire world, proving that even the most entrenched traditions could be changed by people brave enough to envision something better. Their love story had become something larger than romance, evolving into a tale of redemption and transformation that would inspire generations to come. In choosing each other, they had chosen hope over fear, creation over destruction, and love over violence. The trembling warrior who had once known only how to take had learned to give, and in doing so had found a strength greater than any sword could provide. The future stretched before them bright with possibility, and they faced it together, ready for whatever challenges and joys it might bring.